Hello everyone, and welcome to the first module of Chapter 10. So Chapter 10 is on development. And basically in this chapter we are going to start right at conception when the sperm unites with the egg, and we will continue right on up through childhood and adolescence into adulthood and then finally old age. So typically in developmental psychology we tend to focus on childhood as you probably know, the period in life in which the most changes take place. So we will be talking a lot about the period from kind of conception up to birth up till kind of the end of infancy, and then we'll be talking a lot about childhood. So these first two modules will be quite long, and then the last two modules are pretty short. So we'll get started. Some questions that you might have with respect to development or developmental psychology is, when is a human being too old to have a baby? When is the right time to become a parent, to get a job, to go to school, to marry or retire, or even die? So a lot of these questions that many people ask themselves over and over again during life, they don't really have one set answer. And so the universal journey from birth to death is definitely far less predictable than it once was. So for a long time in history, there was kind of almost like a pattern. You grow up, you go to school, you get married, you have your kids, and everything was kind of set out for you. But today, things such as getting an education, changing careers, or having children can occur in almost any decade of adulthood. So developmental psychologists are essentially the ones who are studying the physiological and cognitive changes across the lifespan and how these are affected by a person's genetic predispositions, their culture, their circumstances, and their experiences. So basically how we grow and change over time and how that's influenced by kind of all areas of our life. So some developmental psychologists focus on the mental and social development of children. A major topic in child psychology is socialization, which is the process by which children learn the rules and behaviors expected of them by society. There are others, as I mentioned earlier, who study adolescents, adults, or even the very old. So sometimes we can even have what are known as geriatric psychologists, who are basically studying people in old age. So this chapter is going to discuss some of the major research findings and theories of developmental psychology, beginning with the period before birth, and then continuing on, as I mentioned, into adulthood and old age. So we'll begin with Module 10.1, which is physical development from conception through infancy. So again, we're going to talk right from the moment at which conception occurs. We'll go right up until birth and then basically carry on until the end of infancy in this module. So in order for us as psychologists to study development, we obviously have to have some special methods to be able to measure and track changes over time. So there are two main designs which we can use, and if you were in my class last semester, I may have mentioned these when we were talking about research methods. I'm not sure if I did or not, but they are very popular, especially in developmental psychology. So you can use a cross-sectional design, in which you are measuring and comparing samples of people at different ages at the same time. So basically, if I want to compare the difference between a 10-year-old and a 20-year-old, I'm going to go right now and I'm going to get a group of 10-year-olds and a group of 20-year-olds, and I'm going to study them both. The other type is a longitudinal design, which follows development of the same set of individuals throughout time. So in that case, if I wanted to study the difference between a 10 and a 20-year-old, I would go out and get a group of 10-year-olds right now, and then I would wait 10 years and I would study them again. So longitudinal, you're basically using the same set of people across time, whereas cross-sectional, you're using different people but at the same time. And so both of these methods have their strengths and weaknesses. So there are cohort effects that can sometimes influence cross-sectional designs. So for example, if you were to ask some adults today, maybe you're going to go survey a bunch of 40-year-olds and a bunch of 20-year-olds, and you want to ask them something to do with technology. Well, chances are the technology that's around now for 20-year-olds is very different than what was available for those 40-year-olds when they were that age. So even though, they are 20 years older now, they may lack some of kind of the technological skills and things that might be seen in 20-year-olds today. So differences you might be seeing might not necessarily be due to the fact that, the 40-year-olds are bad with technology. It just might be due to the fact that different generations have different, technologies and things like that available to them. So you can have those issues when you're studying people cross-sectionally. Longitudinal designs, Obviously, as you can imagine, they're much more time and kind of money resource consuming. So you're having to kind of follow these people across time and be able to track them down and things like that. So one of the major problems we deal with is attrition. Attrition basically means that people drop out over time, whether they die or they move away or they just refuse to participate in the research. You tend to lose people across time. So it's great to compare the same individuals to themselves because there are no cohort effects or anything else that's been influencing them, but there are some disadvantages to that type as well. It is a lot more expensive and time consuming, and you can have those attrition effects as well. So both of the methods have definitely different strengths and weaknesses, and depending on what you're hoping to study, you might use one or actually a combination of both. So here's a little diagram that kind of shows you what we're talking about here. So for the cross-sectional design, you can see that you're taking all three groups at the same time point and measuring them, whereas with the longitudinal study, you would take the subjects and measure them at 3 different time points across time. So unfortunately, the very nature of human development makes it a very challenging thing to study. Human development does not unfold in a smooth, linear fashion. Obviously, we don't just learn how to do something and then we never do that thing again, or we never kind of forget what we're doing again. If you think of maybe a child who's, say, potty training, they might go, a few nights without an accident, and then all of a sudden they wet the bed in the middle of the night. And, there's nothing wrong with that. It's basically a fact of human development that it's not always kind of flowing and in that linear fashion. So we use what are known as stage models of development, which reflect the common patterns of relatively stable periods, which are interspersed with periods of rapid reorganization. So basically all that means is that we kind of lay out the different stages that someone's going to go through within their development, and then usually there's like some kind of major thing that has to occur for them to move from one stage to the other. So stage models describe development as occurring in easily identifiable stages, which are separated by a distinctly different pattern and functioning. Like I mentioned, there's usually kind of that one hallmark or milestone that you have to achieve in a certain stage to move forward. And they have been very helpful in aiding psychologists to understand both continuity as well as the way that we change and develop over time. So now we are going to start way back at the beginning. We're going to talk about from one cell, or I guess technically 2 cells, the sperm and the egg cell, to billions. So how infants kind of not only develop prenatally, but also kind of develop after birth up until, the first 1.5 years, 2 years of their life. So as you can probably imagine, there's no other time in human development which brings so many changes so fast as a baby's development before and after birth. Prenatal development begins at the time of fertilization. So at the time of conception, a sperm and an egg cell fuse together, and this fertilized single-celled egg is called a zygote. So the formation of the zygote begins what's known as the germinal stage, which is the first phase of prenatal development, and it essentially spans from conception until 2 weeks. So basically it stays in that germinal stage for a 2-week period. After the zygote is formed, it starts to begin cell division, so the cells start to divide very rapidly, and it begins to travel down the fallopian tubes towards the uterus, where it becomes implanted into the lining of the uterus. And it's now known as a blastocyte. So at that point there are 2 different layers, and that's the point at which it's kind of implanted within the uterus, and it basically stays in the uterus from that point onward. So once it's implanted, that inner portion of the blastocyte becomes what's known as the embryo. I'm sure you've all heard the word embryo before, which signals the beginning of the embryonic stage. It spans weeks 2 through 8, and the embryo begins developing major physical structures such as the heart and the nervous system, as well as the beginning of limbs. So at that point, between weeks 2 and 8, there's a lot going on in terms of development. And then finally, we reach what's known as the fetal stage. So the fetal stage, at which point it's known as a fetus, which again is probably a word that you're all very familiar with, spans weeks 8 through birth. So basically everything else that occurs within the uterus is known as that fetal stage. And so you're having things like the skeletal system, the organs, the nervous systems, they're all developing, becoming more specialized. Muscles develop, the fetus begins to move, and you actually begin to see sleep-wake cycles appear, even while the fetus is still within its mother. So with respect to brain development, because that's something that people ask about a lot, the beginnings of the human brain can be seen during the embryonic stage, so that 2 to 8 week period. By 7 weeks, we do see neurons and synapses develop, and by 11 weeks, there are differentiations between the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So if you remember back to the last course when we talked about biopsych, the cerebellum is kind of that kind of lump at the back of the brain. The cerebrum is basically the main portion of the brain that contains all of the lobes, and the brainstem is what extends down into your spinal cord and kind of connects your brain to the rest of your nervous system. So those things are all starting to develop by 11 weeks, which is pretty amazing when you think of it. At birth, a newborn has an estimated 100 billion neurons, which is kind of amazing because if you think about it, that organism 9 months earlier was essentially just one cell. The sperm and the egg fuse together to create one cell, and then 9 months later, when the baby is born, just in its nervous system alone, it has 100 billion cells. And the brain of a newborn is approximately 25% the size and weight of an adult's. So children's brains have a very high amount of plasticity, meaning that their developing brains will be able to adapt and learn in a variety of environments. You've probably noticed before that children tend to learn really rapidly and they pick up on stuff, even sometimes if you may not want them to, like certain words and things like that. And so basically, when a child is born, they're like a sponge. They just kind of suck up information. So who we are depends on the environment that we're in at that point in our life. It literally structures our brain. And so here's just kind of a little diagram, a table where you can see the different stages of development. So you can see the germinal from 0 to 2 weeks, the embryonic from 2 to 8 weeks, the fetal from 8 weeks until birth. And here's a little diagram that kind of shows you a bit about the fetal brain development. So at 4 weeks, it's very, very primitive, but by 7 weeks, you are starting to see some differentiation between some of the parts of the brain, and then by 11 weeks, you can see the distinction between the cerebral hemisphere, the cerebellum, and that brainstem. And then you can see by 7 and 9 months, you've got, at that point, pretty much a fully developed brain. It's 25% the size of an adult brain, but still contains all the major features. So unfortunately, during pregnancy, there are harmful environmental influences that may affect fetal development in a number of ways. And I'm sure you've all heard of a lot of these. Proper nutrition appears to be the single most important non-genetic factor affecting fetal development. So it is very, very important that during the fetal stage, the mother eats a diet that has, a lot of nutrients in it, because those are going to be passed directly on to the child. Fetal malnutrition can unfortunately lead to lower birth weights, increased likelihood of developing certain diseases and illnesses, and an increased risk of cognitive deficits. So things like attention deficits and control of emotion can actually be impacted while the baby is still in the womb. Teratogens are basically the name given to substances such as drugs or environmental toxins that impair the process of development. They can have, unfortunately, a very disruptive effect on fetal development. One of the most famous examples is that of thalidomide. You may have heard of it. It's okay if you haven't. It was quite a while ago, but it was basically a drug that was hailed as a miracle drug for morning sickness, and it was actually available in Canada for a brief time from 1959 to 1962. And basically what they found out, even though it was very effective in terms of preventing that morning sickness, there were many undesirable effects on the fetus that were involved with ingesting the substance. So unfortunately, babies, there were a lot of miscarriages. Babies were being born with nervous system defects such as blindness and deafness. And there was another, which is probably the most striking symptom of thalidomide during pregnancy, which was something called phocomelia. So basically, babies were born, and instead of having arms and legs, they could have hands or feet that were emerging directly from the shoulders and hips. So they were actually missing limbs in some of these children. So it was, a very extreme example, but definitely an example of how a substance that is taken, ingested during pregnancy, can affect fetal development in a very devastating way. So now we'll talk about some effects of teratogens or substances ingested during pregnancy that you probably are a little bit more familiar with. So I'm sure that most of you, if not all of you, have heard of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, sometimes referred to as fetal alcohol syndrome. It's a condition that was first described in the 1970s, and it involves abnormalities in mental functioning, growth, and facial development. And of course, it occurs in the offspring of women who use alcohol during pregnancy. So it can be very devastating in terms of its impacts on kind of mental functioning and cognitive development. And it is sometimes a little bit easier to kind of identify people who may have FASD due to abnormalities in terms of their facial development. It does occur in approximately 1 in 1,000 births worldwide, and it may be underreported. So we actually have seen that about 1 in 10 pregnancies in Canada involve ingesting alcohol, and rates in isolated northern communities can be more than 60% in terms of pregnancies that have been alcohol exposed. So even though we say that the number is 1 in 1,000, it may actually be a bit more common even than we believe. We do see that individuals diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder tend to exhibit lower birth weights, have smaller brain size, have facial deformities, and exhibit a lack of coordination. And fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is the leading known cause of developmental disability in Canada. We also see that smoking during pregnancy has been linked to a variety of negative outcomes, as I'm sure you're probably all aware of. So smoking while pregnant can increase the risk of miscarriage, can contribute to premature birth, as well as problems with heartbeat and birth weight. And the effects have actually been shown to continue long after birth. So there is an increased risk of sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, as well as issues with hyperactivity, learning difficulties, asthma, and antisocial behavior. So it is important to note, however, these relationships are not necessarily causal. It doesn't mean that the smoking of cigarettes during pregnancy directly caused them. There may be additional variables that are linked to both smoking during pregnancy and the reported developmental deficits, such as things like poverty, low parental education, or other things. But there definitely is kind of a strong correlational relationship there between smoking during pregnancy and a lot of negative health outcomes. So there's a pretty interesting section in your textbook devoted to the topic of premature birth. So as you've probably seen the scientific literacy model sections in the textbook, your text does examine the effects of premature birth using that lens. And so preterm infants are infants that are born at earlier than 36 weeks of gestation compared to the typical gestational age of 40 weeks. So these babies often have underdeveloped brains and lungs, and therefore they struggle with breathing on their own and may have issues with regulating body temperature, among other issues. Modern medicine, fortunately, has led to an approximate survival rate of 95% for babies born at 30 weeks, although the survival rates unfortunately drop to about 50% when born at 25 weeks. So there is a point that unfortunately it is very difficult to save the child. Even though many children born before 25 weeks may survive, they do run a very high risk of damage to the brain and other organs. So even if the baby is able to survive, they unfortunately do tend to have long-term health effects from such an early birth. So there is a program called the Newborn Individualized Developmental Care and Assessment Program, or NIDCAP, which calls for things such as minimal lights, sound levels, and stress. And it has been shown to significantly improve outcomes for preterm infants. So we do see improved motor skills, attention, as well as superior brain development in infants who are subjected to the NIDCAP program. Unfortunately, studies of this program have been criticized for their small sample sizes, and it has not yet been identified exactly why these programs work. So they do seem to be having positive impact, but we're not entirely sure why. So definitely more research remains to be completed. But as there is an estimated 9% of infants who are born preterm worldwide, which is, quite a high number, almost 1 in 10, it is an important area for us to explore. Interventions including massage and things such as kangaroo care, which is basically that skin-to-skin contact that you often see advised for babies and their parents soon after birth, those have been shown to improve the physical and psychological health of infants as well. So we're not entirely sure why a lot of these things work and what mechanisms that they're kind of having their impact by, but there are definitely different interventions that we can use to help increase the chances of successful development in children who are born earlier than they should be. And now I want to take a moment to talk about some myths in the mind. And a lot of the time I leave out these sections in the textbook. There are a lot of myths in the mind section, but this one is one that I feel pretty strongly about. And so I really wanted to kind of bring it to your attention in class. I want to talk about the proposed link between vaccines and autism, because I know that's something that a lot of people believe in, and feel very strongly about, but I would like to share with you kind of the truth of the situation in regards to the research that allegedly proved that vaccines can cause autism. So while we just talked about the fact it is true that there are many negative influences that may affect a child's prenatal and postnatal development, it's also important to ensure that the evidence regarding potential threats is examined for credibility, which was a big issue in this case. So there was a man named Andrew Wakefield. He was in England, and he was the primary researcher in a British lab which published a study linking the MMR vaccine, which is a very common vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella. It's given to pretty much every child. And he published this research stating that that vaccine was linked to autism. The science has been discredited, and Wakefield actually lost his license to practice medicine. So clearly, he was tampering with his evidence there. But unfortunately, the net result has been a public health tragedy. Diseases such as the measles, which of course were prevented by that vaccine, that were all but eradicated in North America and European countries, began to make a comeback. So unfortunately, even though it was proven that his science wasn't correct and that things were falsified, by the time he lost his license and that was kind of retracted, it was too late. A lot of people had kind of taken hold of it, celebrities and things, it got in the media, and unfortunately that's where that rumor that vaccines can cause autism comes from. However, all evidence suggests that vaccines prevent far more problems than they cause. So if you want to talk in terms of scientific evidence, sure, there may be children and even adults at times who react adversely to vaccines, but the same can be said for pretty much any kind of medicine that we've ever taken. And I mean, there are people who can literally die just by ingesting a certain type of food. Myself, for example, I'm severely allergic to peanuts. So in general, vaccines do a lot more benefit than they do harm. So now we're going to talk about infancy. So we've kind of moved past the stage now of talking about, things that happen in the prenatal period, and we're going to talk about things that are postnatal, or things that occur after birth. So compared to the offspring of a lot of other species, healthy newborn humans have fairly limited abilities. A lot of species that are born in the wild, they're born with, hearing and eyesight and things that are very strong right from the get-go. There are certain animals that begin kind of walking or running within days of birth. And so compared to other animals, we are actually pretty limited in our abilities at the time of birth. So we depend entirely on our caregivers to keep us alive, and we very slowly develop our sense of strength and coordination. However, babies have been shown to begin perceiving and making sense of the world even while still in the womb. So by month 4 of prenatal development, the brain starts receiving signals from the eyes and the ears. So even while in the womb, there are things that the baby is experiencing through their sensory system. By 7 to 8 months prenatal, they seem to be listening. So a lot of mothers will kind of read stories to their infants or play music for them, and it does seem to be the case that by 7 to 8 months, so within the last couple months before birth, babies do seem to be listening to what's going on around them. And by the time they are born, babies have actually started to internalize the sounds of their own native tongue, basically just from hearing their parents and other adults and other people converse. And they even appear to cry with an accent. So babies from different cultures and from different languages, they can actually cry with kind of a slightly different tone just based on the accent of their native language, which is pretty incredible. The visual system is probably one of the most poorly developed at birth. Newborns have only about 1/40th the visual ability of adults, and they can only see things for up to about 30 centimeters away, which is kind of adaptive because obviously, it makes sense that at that point the most important thing for the infant to see would be its caregiver. So they don't necessarily need to see as far at that point. However, if objects are close enough for them to see, newborns will track their movement and stare intently at those that they have seen before, so they do seem to recognize objects, and within a few days they begin to imitate facial expressions and prefer face-like stimuli. So they will actually prefer to look at a stimulus that resembles a face more so than a stimulus that has the elements of a face but are in kind of a messed up order. And I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. So the visual system develops in response to the infant's experience of the world. It's the patterns in the world which develop the appropriate neural pathways. So in contrast to vision, the taste and olfaction, the olfaction being kind of your sense of smell, are relatively well developed at birth. Infants tend to show a strong preference for sweet foods, and odors tend to be strong memory cues for them. So smells can kind of help evoke memories, even in the still developing brain. And so here's a picture of what I was talking about by face-like stimuli. So if infants are showed 3 different types of stimuli, the one that looks like a face, the one that is like a scrambled face, so it still contains the elements of a face, but they're not quite in the right order, and then a blank, they will pick the one that most resembles a face. They will kind of prefer that, and we can measure that in terms of their amount of time spent looking at each of the objects. There's also a really interesting developmental test, I guess you would call it, called the visual cliff, and developmental psychologists can actually use it to test for depth perception in children, in babies. So basically what happens is that there is a cliff, and on one side you can very clearly see that there's a pattern directly under you, and on the other side there's a piece of glass, so the infant can crawl out onto it, but it looks as if there's a cliff there, so it looks as if they may fall over the cliff. And what you see basically is children, before they gain a sense of depth perception, they don't have fear. They will kind of easily just crawl right over the edge of that cliff. Whereas the baby that begins to develop depth perception would be very wary of the edge of the cliff. Even though there is no danger, they would kind of stop when they reach what looks like the edge, because they've developed that sense of depth perception. So just 5 months after conception, the fetus begins to have control of voluntary muscle movements. And within the last few months of gestation, basic reflexes begin to occur. So reflexes being involuntary muscular reactions to specific types of stimulation. And so several of these inborn reflexes are developed to help the infant survive. So for example, there's something called the rooting reflex, which is basically where you would touch a child kind of on the cheek near the mouth, and they basically start to kind of orient themselves. They turn their mouth towards whatever it is that's touching them. And so that reflex will help the infant to find and latch onto the breast. There's a grasping reflex that helps the infant to hold on to its caregiver. So you can see how many of these would have kind of an adaptive function. There are reflexes, the reflexes can also be used to help diagnose potential issues with infant development. So if we know that a lot of these reflexes are kind of inborn and they should begin to disappear by around 6 months postnatal, then we can kind of measure whether or not a child is meeting those milestones. So if a child is showing reflexes that are persisting beyond that period, beyond that period, there may be some kind of developmental delay. So over the first 12 to 18 months, motor abilities progress through fairly reliable stages. As you know, babies tend to start crawling first and then standing, usually kind of assisted, kind of holding on to something to help pull themselves up or hold themselves up. And then finally they start walking. So there's a really nice table here that kind of shows you a few of those reflexes that I was just mentioning. So for example, the rooting reflex, as I mentioned, is very important. Basically, if you put some kind of stimulus, whether it's a finger or a nipple or a bottle, near a child's mouth, they will kind of orient themselves to it and begin to kind of make a sucking motion, which of course is very advantageous in terms of being able to acquire nourishment. We also have the moral reflex, which is really interesting. It's also known as the startle reflex because basically it occurs when an infant's head begins to fall, because as you know, if you've ever held a newborn, their heads are very floppy. And so basically if their head starts to fall, they will kind of fling out their arms and then kind of come inward into a hugging motion, and it may be kind of a protective reflex in terms of helping the infant hold on to the mother if it begins to fall. And then finally we have the grasping reflex here, which, as I mentioned before, is basically that if you put a finger or something else into the hand of an infant, they tend to grasp on really hard and not let go. And again, that could be adaptive because it could help them kind of hold on to their mother, and kind of have that connection with the caregiver. So in contrast to reflexes, Motor skill development relies more on practice and deliberate effort, which is in turn related to the environmental factors. So for example, your culture. So depending on the culture you're born in and the expectations that they have for motor development in their children, certain milestones may be reached kind of a little bit earlier or a little bit later on. The brain also undergoes astonishing development during infancy. So if it wasn't crazy enough that it developed billions of cells just within the womb, after childbirth, there are tons and tons of changes occurring within, the first 12-month period. So one key change is the myelination of axons. So again, if you remember back to the biological psychology chapter, you may remember us talking about the myelin sheath, which surrounds the axon of the neurons. It kind of helps protect it and speed the transmission of those neural impulses. And so by 12 months, the myelination of motor pathways can be seen, and this is evident by the infant's abilities to stand, walk, and grasp. There are two other neural processes that further help to coordinate the function of the developing brain. So there's something called synaptogenesis, which is the forming of new synaptic connections. So synaptic connections being where one neuron communicates with another. And then synaptic pruning, which is the loss of weakened nerve cell connections. So basically over time, you're getting the strengthening of the needed connections, the ones that are necessary for survival, and then the pruning away of the unnecessary ones, which basically they both serve to help increase the neural efficiency of the developing brain. Here we have a figure that basically illustrates some of the stages in terms of motor skills development. And so as I just mentioned a minute ago, when a child is born, their head tends to be kind of very floppy and a little bit harder for them to support. So kind of the very first milestone in terms of motor development then would be the ability to actually prop their head up and hold their head up on their own. And so then from there you kind of move on to rolling over, propping up in terms of kind of being able to hold themselves up on their arms, and then typically you would progress on to sitting up, crawling, and then walking. Of course, it's important to note that not all of these stages are going to occur in the same order or even at all in all infants, but in general, these are basically kind of the stages that we see in terms of motor skills development in an infant. And here's a little figure that illustrates that process of synaptic pruning. So you can see that at birth, the infant has a ton of neurons, but there aren't very many synaptic connections between them. So during the first year, it ends up kind of creating a bunch of different connections. So those axons grow longer and they connect to the dendrites of a bunch of other cells. But then over the next few years, the connections that are useful are used more often and therefore are strengthened, whereas the ones that aren't used very often tend to be pruned away. Because of course we don't need connections between every single cell. But at the time of synaptogenesis, when, during that first year of life, a lot of connections are being formed all at once because it's not entirely sure at that point which connections are going to be the most important. And that is the end of Module 1. So I will end this here and I'm going to move on to Module 2. So then we'll talk about basically development through childhood. So we're going to begin at the stage kind of like toddlerhood, just after infancy, and then we'll move right on up to basically the beginning of adolescence, which will be our third module. So thanks for listening, and I will talk to you in the next video.